welcome back to the World Lens podcast. I'm your host, Michelle Evans, and today I'm joined by WTCI board member and president of McIndoe Risk Advisory, Bruce McIndoe. How are you feeling
Oh,
today?
doing good. Up early these days.
Yeah, I'm sure this has been like really busy for you.
Very.
So, yeah, we want to talk about the war in Iran or the conflict in Iran. Um, it's basically moved off the Israel-Iran bilateral axis and onto a wider stage. U.S. and Israel strikes on Iranian oil storage and desalination infrastructure triggered Iranian retaliatory strikes across Gulf states, basically crossing a threshold that may now pull the Gulf Cooperation Council, that's a tongue twister, the GCC is better, from a bystander to an active party. So let's talk about what actually is happening on the ground. Right now, it's more than 1,300 Iranian civilians have died. Over 100,000 Iranians have been displaced, and the strikes are no longer contained to just Iran. They're now being reported across multiple Gulf states as it widens. So, Bruce, for business leaders and policymakers trying to navigate this, how do you hold the humanitarian dimension alongside the economic one? And does the scale of this impact on civilians change the political calculus for how anybody new to this conflict comes to the table?
Yeah, I mean, this we're jumping into the big ocean. So this morning, I think the count was 20 countries are engaged and or supporting one of the parties. So that has expanded, but we can't neglect that there's about 800,000 people that have been displaced in Lebanon as Israel attacks Hezbollah. So I think you have to view the humanitarian and economic dimensions as one system. And, large scale civilian displacement, deaths are morally significant. That's going to motivate people and that are supporting each party, right? And but they also, accelerate that political pressure. They create reputational exposure for the nations that are involved, and as well as labor disruption. These are people that were actively living and contributing, hopefully, to their societies, and then ultimately, policy intervention. So what I'm hoping that all of that will push all parties, but the key parties toward talks. And but unfortunately, as we know, on a long history in this region, it can also make them dig in harder, right? So for business leaders, the key to is to treat this humanitarian fallout as a primary business risk indicator, not a side issue. So keeping an eye on that and seeing how the countries are aligning and acting is a big part
Hmm.
of what we're monitoring.
Yeah, the supply chain fallout is already cascading too. We have four of the world's largest shipping carriers, Maersk, Hapag-Lloyd, MCS, and CMA CGM. They basically suspended their Hormuz transits. The Hapag-Lloyd company, they've introduced an emergency war risk surcharge of $1,500 per container, and CMA CGM is charging up to $4,000 per unit. With the shipping just kind of starting to return to the Red Sea after the Houthi disruptions, we now have a double blockage, it seems, right? With
Yep.
Hormuz and the Bab-el-Mandeb Strait. How does this compare to the chaos we saw with the supply chain after COVID? And what industries are most exposed that companies and consumers might not be thinking about?
Well, this is, I would say, very different from COVID
Yeah.
in one kind of key way. COVID was a system-wide shock, right?
Mm.
That broke supply and demand essentially at the same time across factories, labor, markets, ports, trucking, everything, right? Consumer
Mm-hmm.
behavior being key. That was the demand, right?
Right.
So, so here, what we're looking at is a choke point shock. So, an isolated but just immediate shock to the system. So it's more geographically concentrated, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and faster in impact, as we've seen, right?
Yeah.
But these, two arteries being impaired at once is really the main difference. COVID was rolling shortages over multiple months that left containers abandoned in odd markets, and so those prices came up too. And so anyway, so in thinking about what industries, I guess the underappreciated risk is it's not just all about oil. It's also
Mm-hmm.
liquid natural gas, LNG, it's chemicals, it's plastics, fertilizers, packaging, essentially anything that a manufacturer or retailer has tied to one, Asia, Europe shipping lanes, and obviously, oil as a key component. So I
Mm-hmm.
think the real exposure, and I just booked 3 trips yesterday morning early. I see transport, obviously, right? Airlines and those kinds of things.
Yeah.
I was hoping to go to Japan. I looked at the ticket to go to Japan and it was almost 2x what I looked at a couple of weeks ago.
Ooh.
So those airlines are quick to,
Yeah.
understand that their prices are going to go up. So energy, transport, and then of course I said, industrial inputs,
Right.
hitting at the same time. Sure.
Interesting. I don't know. I guess I never thought that like airlines or transit would be a factor in this simply because, it just doesn't seem as connected as everything else when it comes to that.
Well, it's messing up their routing, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that's burning more fuel, and more fuel is going to be more expensive, and they're going to be
Yeah.
running less flights to this theater. So yeah, it's all increasing costs.
Yeah. So the GCC Ministerial Council, they've already stated that attacks on one member are treated as attacks on all. Basically, you come at one, you got us all.
Yeah.
Um, Analysts are saying that most likely near-term response is still defensive first. Walk us through this escalation ladder.
Hmm.
What's the trigger that moves the GCC from defensive operations into direct operational support? And what would it take to bring them into the fight, like outright?
Um, yeah. For them to come in, I think is going to be would have to be something very significant. We're starting to see it, and that's attacking infrastructure and
Mm-hmm.
desalination plants.
Yeah.
People don't always think about that, but a good size of what the Saudis pull out of the ground in oil, they expend turning it into water, right?
Right.
And then a population that doesn't have water, that's an existential threat in 3 to 4 days, right? Without
Right.
water, you're done, right? So that's a very serious target, infrastructure target. So, but I would say let's think about the escalation ladder, now.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what does it look like? So, what we're seeing right now is, as you mentioned, coordinated GCC defensive operations, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they're providing, and this is what's causing friction, expanded U.S. access, right? But they are, having tighter regional command and intelligence integrations. So, all really trying to support the GCC countries to be able to ward off incoming, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's going on now. The next rung that we see would be where selected GCC states, and clearly the ones that are getting beat up are Bahrain and UAE, and then of course Saudi to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
If we see them providing like explicit operational support for the U.S. and possibly Israel, um, then sort of directing off offensive themselves, but providing material support, that's going to move the escalation up. So I think, what does that mean? If you see basing of equipment, if you see refueling, maritime escorting, missile defense integration, maybe even cyber and other things. That means that they are now leaning forward into the fight, right? Rather than
Mm-hmm.
just being a victim. The higher risk run is if we do see retaliatory GCC strikes or direct participation in a broader coalition. If they continue, then obviously boom, now we're in that next thing, and that drives us to what I would call kind of a worst case where you have a fully engaged regional war
Mm-hmm.
with now you have all these countries are now
Involved.
combatants.
Yeah.
And then Hormuz and the energy export nodes and desalination plants and airports and all this stuff become routine targets and taken out of productive use. And throughout all of this, and I think we're already seeing it now from reporting, but we will see more and more for every wrong, the Chinese and Russian engagement is going to increase. So
Mm-hmm.
providing intelligence, sure. Now Chinese are talked about providing material support to Iran, right, and bringing their
Mm-hmm.
ships in. So it's all of that that's just building, and you know we'll see where it builds to.
Yeah. So I want to bring it back to good old U.S. soil. Uh,
Okay, good.
for most American households, the most immediate impact is at the pump. I just felt that earlier.
Mhm.
Gas prices, which pretty much sat near a multi-year low at $2.73 a gallon earlier this year, have jumped to above $3.10 within days of those strikes, and it's still climbing.
Mhm.
Economists estimate that for every $10 increase in oil price, gas price is going to go up 25 cents. But the worst case scenario here isn't about the super expensive oil. It's routine Iranian attacks actually on the desalination plants that you mentioned,
Yeah.
the LNG terminals and the export nodes pushing the Brent well past $150 or 200. For everyday Americans, we're already pretty stretched thin after 5 years of elevated prices. What does a regionalized conflict like this mean for household budgets? And how does it interact with the Fed's plans? And is stagflation back on the table? Yikes.
Oh, the nasty word stagflation.
Yeah.
I would say, in listening to some of the administration, both from Trump down. I think this is what the Trump administration is. They're scrambling for a narrative and hopefully an off ramp
Mm-hmm.
because of all this, right? Because we're heading
Right.
into midterms, and it's in real terms, it's like tomorrow, right? So that's their big pressure right now is that if this continues to grow up that escalation ladder and we go to a global recession, that then
Mm-hmm.
this is going to be, this was a war of choice, right? And anyway, so for everyday Americans, and you saw it yourself, the
Mm-hmm.
first squeeze comes at the pump, then through food and shipping and
Yep.
airfare and every utility costs, which people are already angry about with how energy is being chewed up for the AI world.
Yeah.
Anyway, so higher oil in this similar kind of like tariffs, is a tax on household budgets. It
Mm-hmm.
drives overall inflation. So for the Fed, that makes rate cuts incredibly hard because they cannot ease aggressively into an energy-driven inflation shock.
Right.
They'll and there's a lot of concern out there whether Trump's choice now to make those decisions, will he, right? So that's a separate conversation. So I would say stagflation, because of this shock, is not the base case yet,
Okay.
but it's clearly, I would say, back in what we would call the risk set, right? And that will depend on the labor market, whether it remains soft or contracts. That will lower demand, and
Mm-hmm.
then you have the setup for stagflation, right? Weaker activity, sticky inflation, and Fed with limited room to help in the process. That would be the flag that would say we could head into stagflation pretty aggressively.
Fingers crossed that doesn't happen because no one wants that.
Yeah.
Geopolitically, though, the war is reshuffling some alliances and exposing fault lines in global energy dependence. Asia is most acutely exposed region. Roughly 84% of Hormuz oil goes to Asian markets. Um, Pakistan and Bangladesh face severe LNG shortfalls. There's speculation that Chinese flag vessels are receiving a little bit of special treatment from Iran's, blockade, pretty much mirroring what happened during the Houthi attacks. The countries that are most exposed here are in the Western Asia, like I just mentioned. How does that reshape the global response to this conflict? And if Chinese vessels are quietly allowed through these ports while Western ships aren't, what does that do to the already strained relationship between China and the Western-led training world?
Yeah, we'll talk about maybe the Chinese vessels first because that's also a changing dynamic. But
Yeah.
if Chinese vessels or linked vessels are kind of quietly treated better than the rest,
Mm-hmm.
um, this that would be quite damaging, right? It would
Mm-hmm.
signal that trade is no longer mediated by global rules, right? And no
Mm-hmm.
rules order anymore, but by geopolitical alignment. And we talked about this before, and this would further
Mm-hmm.
accelerate that fragmentation of the global trading order, right? We talked about BRICS, we talked about China,
Mm-hmm.
the global South, but more importantly, around de-dollarization. So if you want to dig into this a little bit more, go back to that last year's podcast,
Episode, yes.
and you can understand that. But I would say that the interesting thing was in the last less than 24 hours is that the IRGC, right, um, basically said that they will start allowing, all Arab and European countries that
Mm.
expel U.S. And Israeli ambassadors and political people, from their territories, they would give them complete freedom and authority to pass through the straits, right? So now they're
Mm.
not just giving preferential treatment to China, which they
Mm.
need, but now they're
Canada.
opening up saying if you play our game and you do this, you can also enjoy passage. So that's the shipping part of it. But back to the impacts, like I said earlier, there's like 20 countries now, right?
Yeah.
And the next big chunk, of course, are in Asia, and you mentioned a number of them because they carry the most energy exposure. Again, what's the one key shock right now, right? The whole
Mm-hmm.
energy oil shock. So they have that exposure in a greater way. So they don't view this in the same way that Washington is, right? When you think about like the security lens, right, or
Mm-hmm.
even some European capitals. For most of these Asian countries, the immediately question is not alliance signaling to these nations, whatever China, Western Europe. It's energy access. It's power, right? Electrical power,
Mm-hmm.
reliability, inflation that everyone's dealing with and looking at right now, and social stability in the event that things start crumbling down, right? So the pressure from Asia is going to be a major de-escalation force, right? So getting restoration of shipping and getting practical carve outs like we just saw
Yeah.
to and they are not interested in any kind of maximalist geopolitical kind of confrontation to take Iran and have regime change, right? So and
Mm-hmm.
this is exactly what Iran is expecting by what they're doing, right? Putting that
Mm-hmm.
huge political pressure globally. So that's where we are. So they're going to be in the camp of let's get this shut down. Let's get an off ramp as quickly as possible.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned that there are like 20 countries now, so, the
Mhm.
Gulf states aren't the only ones feeling this impact of this conflict. The UK actually has permitted the US to use British military bases for defensive purposes. France has moved its aircraft carrier toward the Mediterranean, and Canada is pretty much like, we can't rule out our participation in this. And Qatar's energy minister has issued a warning that if the war continues, Gulf energy producers may be forced to halt exports and declare force majeure, which is basically saying, like, we can't do these contracts because of this. You know what that means.
Yeah, out of
Um,
our control, right?
exactly. Um, he said that this will bring down economies of the world.
Yes.
Yeah, this is starting to look less like a regional conflict and more like another coalition of the willing in the making. At what point does Western military entanglement change diplomatic off ramps? And what does that mean for international businesses and trade relationships that some of our WTCI members have spent decades building?
Well, we'll start out with it's not the coalition of the willing, it's the coalition of the hesitant. I don't think any country is
Willing.
quote unquote, yeah, partner country is sees this as a
Mm-hmm.
strong thing that they want to support. But anyway, um, so Western involvement, I guess the shift would be from what we call asset protection, right? This defensive and protecting assets. If they
Right.
actually get into the operational fray, and now they have operational ownership, right, where they're directing attacks by ship or by air. So with UK and others positioning the equipment and protecting Cyprus and those kinds of things, that's going to keep it on that side of the ledger. If they actually start launching, now they're in it, right? So that's what I
Mm-hmm.
think all of them are trying to not only weigh but avoid, right?
Mm-hmm.
So again, so the UK is framing this as a defensive role, right? France also is
Mm-hmm.
talking about their navy being defensive support and possible supporting escort operations and those kinds of things. So that's what they're communicating. Um, if, like I said, if any of them are perceived as sustaining the campaign, right? Then that off ramp gets a lot narrower, and Tehran's going to see this. They're not going to separate Washington from these partners, and that
Right.
raises the risk of retaliation, which is what I
Yep.
want to get to now a wider set of
Mm-hmm.
Western linked assets and personnel and commercial interests when you start bringing in France and the UK and Canada and others, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that would be tragic for
Yeah.
and for global business back to us. The
Mm-hmm.
danger is that these trade relationships that have been built over decades in this previous rules-based system suddenly get filtered through now geopolitics by
Mm-hmm.
flag, by insurer, by bank, political alignment. So this is when this regional disruption fractures into a global structural change. And we've talked about this in prior web
Mm-hmm.
podcasts where you start having this economic and spheres of influence fragmentation. And
Right.
so this could be a catalyst to accelerate that in a significant way.
Oh, fun. Energy analysts are framing this as a potential 1970s style energy crisis, which I think was also the last time that stagflation really happened,
Actually,
right?
yeah, I guess. Yep.
Mm,
I was thinking
Turns the
maybe
peak.
during the financial crisis. I think we teetered on it, but yeah, go ahead.
Ah. Um, Goldman Sachs estimates Brent could reach $120 to $150 in a full-scale war scenario. Deutsche Bank has modeled it's approaching $200 if Iran successfully deploys their mines. And one analyst pretty bluntly says a prolonged Hormuz closure is guaranteed global recession, which we've mentioned.
Mhm.
And if Gulf Energy knows desalination plants, airports, US bases across the Arabian Peninsula become routine targets, inflation adjusted oil at $200 could drag us into stagflation.
Mhm.
Bruce, can you whip out that crystal ball of yours for a sec? How does this play out with the two scenarios where one where this winds down in the near term and one where it doesn't? And for global companies that have spent years de-risking their supply chains after COVID, is this finally a moment that forces a fundamental restructuring of what manufacturing, where it happens, and where energy comes from?
Okay.
I
I
know that's a
guess,
lot.
yeah, I've just before we jump into kind of the two, this or that,
Mm-hmm.
I work, with a lot of large multinational global companies.
Mm-hmm.
Most of them are already de-risking for exactly this, not
Okay.
planning this particular incident
Mm-hmm.
and conflict, but the fact that this, what we talked about these spheres of influence and fragmentation, right? And so starting to build capability in either two or three hemispheres or regions. So Asia, kind of Europe, and then Western, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so that's already in play. This is going to accelerate that, as we said before. So two broad paths, I guess. In the if there is a near term wind down scenario, um, the fighting's going to remain intense, but then obviously, if it's near term, it'll be short. Shipping lanes, which we're already seeing games being played to how to figure out how to get those lanes
Mm-hmm.
reopened, and they restore the exports, and oil comes down off of these highs and wherever it peaks, and we kind of saw a little bit of that yesterday when they peaked over 100, and then
Mm-hmm.
Trump started talking about being a short war instead of weeks and long, and then it dropped, and
Yeah.
so we'll see what happens day by day. So the damage is real in this scenario, but it's mostly cyclical, just whether it's a
Yeah.
day to day or whatever. So we'll see some higher costs, and companies are going to absorb that through, like they did, inventory buffers, safety
Mm-hmm.
stock, alternative routing, selective repricing of product, those kinds of things. So let's
Mm-hmm.
look at the longer war scenario. As I mentioned before, this stops becoming a market shock and becomes a structural change, right?
Yeah.
So if Hormuz stays impaired and Bab-el-Mandeb remains contested, right? So both of those waterways
Mm-hmm.
and all of this stuff is hit, and everything's a big mess. Then that everything is going to slow growth, and China has already reduced their targets for this year because of where we are already, right? So
Mm-hmm.
slow growth globally, and it's going to drive up and keep inflation high, right? So that is the pathway to a disruptive global recession or
Right.
stagflation or some combination of both, depending on local markets,
Mm-hmm.
right? So for global companies, this is, I don't think this is another like forcing event. It's not a full reset everywhere, but COVID taught companies how to diversify and become, have less risk concentration. I think Apple
Mm-hmm.
now is like 40%, I think, or some large number of their phones now are made in India, right?
Okay.
So, as a good example. So, this kind of conflict is going to teach global companies to diversify trade lanes, energy exposure, and
Mm-hmm.
geopolitical dependence, i.e., drive that fragmentation into these fragmented markets where they can
Mm-hmm.
operate and then trade between these markets to maintain resiliency.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
So I know for, the first couple days of this war, it was trying to, regime change. But there was a whole thing about like who's going to be the successor. Well, they've named one, the late Supreme Leader's son. Um, but he seems to be considered a little more hardline than his father. He has really strong ties to the IRTC and some of Iran's most conservative, like ideological factions. Does having a new supreme leader in place close the door to this fracture scenario, or does a harder line successor who owes his position to the IRGC, simply mean the war will continue in a different kind of certainty?
Um, yes and no. So no, it does not end the fracture scenario, right? This
Mm-hmm.
is, fracturing within Iran and within the region. It possibly postpones it or reshapes it as Mojtaba gets his role in there, and we'll see. Obviously the Israelis and the U.S. are aggressively trying to track him, and my warning to him would be is don't touch anything modern. So I'm sure they're doing that. Um, but anyway, yeah. So with a harder line successor closely tied to the IRGC, uh, you know, suggests more short-term unity around continuing the war, not less, right? And that the price of that, I think will be a more militarized regime with deeper internal stresses,
Mm-hmm.
and then over time, not in this window, but in a longer term window, can easily fracture the society, right? And
Yeah.
especially if other groups like the Kurds and others start getting involved, right, in Iran and
Mm-hmm.
elsewhere. So I think this is where some analysts are saying we may have unleashed through this fracturing and of these factions uh, something that we could see remain in place and evolve over years or even decades now as these, depending on how that plays out. So that's you know what the kind of unintended consequence of
Consequence.
this
Mm-hmm.
action could be.
Mm. So, last question.
Okay.
What is the single indicator you'll be watching most closely over the next 30 days?
The indicator that I would watch is how many actual shipments, tankers, are flowing through the Straits of Hormuz.
Mm.
Not rhetoric, it's not market forecast, but actual monitoring the ships and how many of them are starting to move through that straits. If the ships start moving again at scale, that suggests that the crisis may be contained at least, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if they don't, then you can assume that this is going to be a larger
Long.
energy shock, more inflation, everything that we talked
Mm-hmm.
about. So my thing would be, in the next 30 days, watch ships, not speeches.
Mm. That's a good point. Well, Bruce, this
Yeah.
seems to be unfolding by the hour as we've seen,
Yes.
and the ripple effects will be felt in boardrooms and gas stations alike. Thank you for helping us make sense of it today. Hopefully,
Oh,
it's not too different tomorrow.
yes. Take care, Michelle.
If you want more insights like this, member news, and information about upcoming events, visit WTCI.org and follow us on all social channels at WTC Institute. Until next time. Thanks, Bruce.